Hey there, welcome to another segment of 5149 on Breaking Points, where we dive into different topics at the intersection of business, politics, and society. And as school is officially now in session, I want to take a few minutes today to dive deeper into the teacher shortage crisis facing public schools all over the United States. We're going to cover what you've maybe been hearing in the news about the teacher shortages, but also major aspects of the issue that I think the media has been ignoring, perhaps deliberately or unconsciously due to certain underlying biases they have.
This morning, the school year's first bell is also an alarm bell as schools nationwide struggle to find enough teachers.
There is a growing crisis in American education, an extreme shortage of teachers.
The U.S. is coping with a nationwide shortage of teachers, numbering in the hundreds of thousands.
Men and women who educate our children are increasingly burnt out, struggling with the aftermath of 2+ years of the pandemic, increasing scrutiny over curriculums that has put many of them at the center of educational culture wars, not to mention fears for their own safety. And oh, by the way, there's always that issue of low pay. Nationwide, there are more than 280,000 fewer teachers now than at the start of the pandemic. 280,000! That's according to the Department of Labor. That is a crisis that is impacting school systems in both urban areas and rural areas.
So just to provide some additional context to that 280,000 number reported in the media, although we don't know exactly how many U.S. classrooms are short teachers for the next school year, there is no national database that tracks the issue. We can look at state and district level reports to try to contextualize how bad things actually are. According to recent reporting from the Washington Post, quote, the Nevada State Education Association estimated that roughly 3,000 teaching jobs remain unfilled across the state's 17 school districts as of early August. In a January report, the Illinois Association of Regional School Superintendents found that 88% of school districts statewide were having problems with teacher shortages, while 2,040 teacher openings were either empty or filled with a less than qualified hire. And in the Houston area, the largest 5 school districts are all reporting that between 200 and 1,000 teaching positions remain open. Now, I talked about this exact issue on my YouTube channel a few weeks ago and received a number of responses from teachers that the problem is indeed widespread. So what exactly is going on here, and what are the solutions?
We're calling for a federal government involvement, the state involvement. In our state, we're seeing this investment in education. We had a 0-0 added to our public school funding in terms of investment from our Joint Finance Committee. We can't continue to do this. Wisconsin's right now always within that 1 to 3 in terms of the lowest performance.
That was Carlton Jenkins, superintendent of Madison's Metropolitan School District, speaking with Chuck Todd on NBC News Meet the Press. He talked about the lack of school funding being a big problem, and there is an argument to be made here. Money helps. With more money, you can immediately go out and hire more teachers, more support staff, buy supplies, improve facilities, etc. However, simply saying we need more money to fix this issue is different than following the money. And I think this is where mainstream coverage of this issue has led us astray. According to data from the National Center for Education Statistics, the graph on your screen plots expenditures per full-time student for elementary and secondary education of OECD countries by GDP per capita. The blue line indicates the linear relationship between education spending and GDP per capita. For the most part, the higher the GDP, the more a country spends on education. Makes logical sense. Now, one important thing to notice here is that the US is not an outlier. We are spending just as much on education as other countries. Another thing to read into perhaps is which countries are falling above that regression line and which ones are falling below. A country with a plot above the regression means that they spend more on education than what would maybe otherwise be expected on average based on their GDP per capita, which could be interpreted positively in that in this set of countries, comparatively, they might value public education more and see it as a worthwhile investment to make. The US is one of the countries above that line. So it isn't entirely the case that the US isn't investing in public education. They are, but the overall spend is only a part of the equation. And since we're talking about teachers here, let's examine the teachers' cut of the pie. According to reporting from the Reason Foundation, quote, the United States already spends more on public education per student than almost any other developed nation in the world. Yet the US does not make the top of the list for teacher salaries, lagging behind nations like Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, and Canada, which also spend less per pupil. So logically, the next thread that we have to pull on is, where is all the money going if not to teachers? Well, according to a 2018 OECD report, America spends higher proportions of education dollars on non-teaching staff, 27% of US spending compared to the OECD average of 15%, and devotes a lower proportion of education spending to teacher compensation, 54% compared to an OECD average of 63%. And these administrative and support staff costs continue to grow. Administrative staff numbers have grown over 5 times faster than student populations in public schools since 2000. One of the major reasons behind these spending patterns is American dependence on school districts. While many European and Asian countries don't have separate elected bodies to administer public education, the United States is somewhat unique in that it has thousands of locally elected school districts, many of which are quite small. This equates to hundreds of thousands of administrators and so lots of dollars not going to teachers. Now, the last time I spoke about this topic, I was asked, well, the US public schools have always been organized into many local school districts, but the increase in non-teaching staff seems to be more recent. So what exactly is going on here that explains this change? It's a fantastic question. And to answer it, I think we have to think about what incentive structures are in place. In an article in the Stanford Review addressing administrative bloat in the higher education system, which suffers from, I think, a lot of the same issues as primary and secondary education, reporter Berber Jin wrote, quote, "Unlike faculty who gain prestige through quality teaching and innovative research, administrators move up the career ladder by expanding bureaucracy. In other words, an administrator's status is proportional to the number of administrators she manages and the scale of her programs." I think his commentary there is incredibly insightful. Think about maybe your own job progression. Let's say you want to go from a project coordinator to a project manager. That prerequisite, of that promotion is kind of predicated on the existence of another coordinator for you to manage. In order to move up, you necessarily need to increase the size of your team. And that's, I think, how headcounts can balloon over the course of years and decades. Now, of course, in the private sector, in the business world, budgets are a little bit easier to scrutinize. Is your team contributing to the overall growth or the profitability of the company? If it's not, headcount reductions are coming. But with education, where there is no profit motive, an admin team's performance metrics are probably a little bit harder to come by, which leaves the institution exposed to administrative bloat. Let's take a look at the table on your screen to examine the hard data, and this is once again from the National Center for Education Statistics. Over the course of about 2 decades, from the year 2000 to 2017, school district administrative staff, and that includes officials, administrators, and instruction coordinators, have grown a whopping 75%, while instructional staff, and this cohort includes principals, assistant principals, teachers, instructional aides, librarians, and guidance counselors, the folks who actually interact with the students, has only grown 12% over the same period. Those are the cold hard facts, can't argue with it. But remember Carlton Jenkins from earlier, when NBC News, Meet the Press, and other mainstream programs bring on school district superintendents like him to talk about solutions and how we can solve our education crisis, they're highly unlikely to call out the redundancies in their own department and suggest a headcount reduction in their own teams as a solution. So could it be possible that school district officials and administrators are okay with sacrificing teaching quality in order to preserve their own jobs? Some believe so. Nancy Bailey, author of Losing America's Schools, The Fight to Reclaim Public Education, wrote back in 2016, quote, "Those in charge of public schools and politicians are hypocrites when it comes to the rhetoric surrounding a teacher shortage. School districts around the country are describing hundreds of classrooms they can't seem to fill with qualified teachers. This has been a manipulated ploy to get rid of veteran teachers and employ alternative, revolving door, unqualified teachers who will settle for smaller salaries." So to put it bluntly, instead of properly dealing with a teacher shortage that arguably they manufactured, the large educational bureaucracy, in order to preserve their own position of power, are choosing to deal with it in other ways, like creating an environment that creates a downward pressure on teachers' wages, which has been happening for quite some time now, as well as turning to privatization. I'll give you an example. On your screen is a paper put out by DC's Office of the State Superintendent of Education entitled High Dosage Learning, a Proven Strategy to Accelerate Student Learning. High dosage learning is a new buzzword that's kind of all the rage right now in the education world that basically means one-on-one tutoring. And that apparently is the answer our school boards and our government are pushing. But which groups are funding this push? Future Ed, a think tank out of George Washington University made up of Teach for America types, some from the Broad Institute, promotes tutors in the case for a national tutoring system. They're funded by the Barr Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the City Fund, the Joyce Foundation, the Overdeck Family Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation. So is the picture becoming more clear now? The push for tutors to replace teachers comes down to advancing the interests of the wealthy and the powerful, because remember, nonprofits like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation don't exist to solve any fundamental problems in society, or at least that's definitely not at the top of their list of priorities, but rather those organizations exist to advance and protect their own status and that of its patrons. Perhaps worse, it injects a profit incentive, a money-making opportunity into public K-12 education, something that could prove very beneficial to a certain group of folks who run in those elite circles. How lucrative is the future of big tutoring? According to industry estimates, between 2020 and 2025, the private tutoring market in the US is expected to grow by over 8% year over year, roughly $8.37 billion. So a lot of money to be made there, but the reality is promoting private tutoring as a mechanism to augment public education will only further entrench the country's widening class divide, right? One group who has access to a private tutor and another who doesn't.
I'm a PhD student who's studying teacher attrition and the long-term impacts it's having on our field. Class sizes will be so large that individual teachers, either legally or physically or both, can't handle them. And so students are going to get pushed out into large group sessions that have a person who is supervising them. The person supervising them isn't necessarily going to be a teacher, think more like a lunchroom monitor situation. And the students will be doing like a Khan Academy or otherwise online learning platform. This will likely take place in a cafeteria, in a gym, or just a really large classroom, and they'll be in there on their headphones and laptops learning and being supervised by a human. I'm using the word teacher lightly because it's really just going to be an adult in the room who maybe passed a background check. So school attendance will still be mandatory, but it won't truly be school. It won't be a place of education, fostering learning, supporting disabilities. So what you're witnessing is the absolute deprofessionalization of teaching and shifting it from a career to a gig industry.
Imagine that future, a country where teaching will no longer be a career, but just a gig. Classrooms staffed with independent contractors who aren't at all invested in education, but who are simply there to trade his or her time for an hourly wage, most likely with minimal benefits. I think public education maybe is the quintessential example of a long-term investment in the future of our country, right? You make that investment now to create a strong foundation from which to build a nation. And that's part of, I think, the legacy of America. Right now, we should be focused on eliminating administrative bloat within our public education system, finding better ways to allocate funding to teaching roles, and breaking up the parasitic relationship between private interests and public education. But instead, we're essentially trading away our long-term prosperity for another revenue stream for the rich and the wealthy. And if you want to talk about free market competition, if we continue to allow our public education system to deteriorate through greed, through privatization, not only will this have catastrophic effects on our own communities, but the US economy will not remain competitive. We may not feel it right away, but it's inevitable. So to sum it up, yes, we have a teacher shortage, no doubt, but we also have a large bureaucratic network of administrators and private interests siphoning off public resources, crippling teachers and students, all while pushing for mass privatization of the public education system for the sake of self-preservation and profit generation. That is it for me today. I hope you found this segment about the teacher shortage crisis to be helpful and informative. There's a lot to cover about this topic, so I'm sure there are some things that I've missed. So I encourage you to comment below. I also encourage you to check out and subscribe to my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee, where I make videos on topics related to business, politics, and society. Link will be in the description below. Thank you for tuning into Breaking Points. As always, I appreciate your time today.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.